The business of judging the honourable mention for Marrows at the Cartmell Allotment Society's annual fete was, in its own way, as solemn as a court summons. Mrs. Millicent Gable of the Town Council, a woman whose hat suggested a deep-seated mistrust of the sky, was peering at a vegetable that had achieved the self-satisfied heft of a minor civil servant who has just been awarded an OBE. The symmetry is commendable. "Mr. Potter," she announced, though her tone implied that nature had got rather above itself. "But there is a certain listlessness to the stem." Mr. Potter, whose face was the colour of baked earth, merely nodded. He had been through this ritual for 40 years. He knew that true victory lay not in the rosette, but in the knowledge that his marrow could, if called upon, serve as a viable sea defence all around the vicarage lawn. The quiet, earnest machinery of an English Saturday was turning. Tea was being dispensed from a formidable urn, a tombola spun with the promise of unclaimed Christmas gifts, and the Reverend Alastair Finch was moving through the crowd with the strained bonhomie of a man who desperately wished to be liked. He was new to Cartmell and still navigated its social currents with the caution of a man paddling in a crocodile enclosure. "A splendid turnout," he said to anyone who made eye contact. "A real testament to the town's community fibre." From the corner of his eye he watched the church verger, Mr. Cecil Trimble, who stood by the lich gate like a statue commemorating disapproval. Trimble had been part of St. Michael's Church since before its stones had fully settled, and he viewed the Reverend Finch's attempts at modernity, the folk music Eucharist, the coffee mornings as a personal affront. His fate on the vicarage lawn was to Trimble tantamount to holding a discotheque in the chancel. Inspector Pubright of the Chalmsbury Constabulary was observing the scene from a discreet distance, a cup of tea warming his hands. He was not on duty. He was merely present, as was expected. In a town like Cartmell, attendance at such events was less a matter of choice and more a civic subscription. He watched Sergeant Love, a man of admirable literalness, gamely attempting to guess the weight of a fruitcake that looked dense enough to alter local gravity. The church clock of St. Michael's, a reliable, iron-willed timekeeper, began its preparatory whirring. A collective, subconscious pause settled over the fete. It was 5 minutes to noon. Soon, the great bell, Old Matthew, would strike 12. Its deep, sonorous chime rolling over the water meadows and signalling to all that the universe, and more importantly lunchtime, was in its proper place. The clock hands climbed. They met at the zenith. The intricate clockwork in the tower clicked, a promise of sound, and then nothing. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of noise. It was a positive, palpable thing. It was a hole punched in the fabric of the day. Heads turned towards the stone tower. Mrs. Gable paused, her critique of a second, more ostentatious marrow dying on her lips. The Reverend Finch's smile faltered. Even Sergeant Love looked up from the fruitcake, a flicker of professional concern in his eyes. "Clock must have stopped," someone murmured, but a glance confirmed the hands were perfectly aligned. The mechanism had worked. The hammer had swung. The bell had simply refused to speak. The Reverend Finch, sensing a pastoral duty was required, began to move towards the church. "A technical hitch, I'm sure. Mr. Trimble, perhaps you would be so good as to—" But the verger was already gone. He had moved with a speed that belied his years, disappearing into the cool dark of the church porch, his face a mask of grim premonition. The small crowd waited. The quiet unease was now a low hum of speculation. It was one thing for a train to be late, or the post to be misdirected. It was quite another for St. Michael's to withhold its voice. It felt like a breach of contract. Minutes later, Trimble reappeared. He was pale. He clutched the heavy iron ring of the tower door keys in one hand, and they trembled. He walked directly to the Reverend Finch, ignoring everyone else. "It's gone," he said, his voice a dry rasp, as if he'd swallowed dust. "The clock mechanism?" the Reverend asked, hopefully. "A spring, perhaps?" Trimble shook his head slowly. He looked past the vicar, his gaze settling on the solid, reassuring form of Inspector Pubright, who had begun to drift closer, his teacup now forgotten. Not the clock, the verger said, his voice gaining a tremor of pure sacrilege. The tongue. The clapper's gone. For a moment, the verger's words hung in the air, an object as solid and unbelievable as a meteorite landing on the prize-winning petunias. The clapper's gone. It was a statement of such profound domestic violation that it took several seconds to be properly absorbed. It was not a jewel heist or a bank robbery. It was an act of anatomical aggression against the town itself. Mrs. Millicent Gable was the first to find her voice, which she deployed with the force of a civic bulldozer. Gone? What do you mean gone? An object of that magnitude does not simply vanish. It is a public asset. This is an outrageous act of vandalism. Inspector, I trust the police will be treating this with the utmost seriousness. Inspector Pubright, who had moved to the centre of the small, stunned group, gave a slight, placatory nod. Every seriousness, Mrs. Gable. Sergeant Love will be taking a preliminary statement. Sergeant Love, looking mournful at the abandonment of the fruitcake, produced a notebook with a sigh. The theft of a bell clapper did not feature in any of his training manuals. He was a man who appreciated clear-cut motives, greed, jealousy, rage. This smacked of something else entirely, something frustratingly abstract. The news, having breached the initial dam of shock, now flooded the vicarage lawn with astonishing speed. It passed from the tombola to the tea-urn, from the cake stand to the lich gate, mutating with each telling. It wasn't just stolen. It had been melted down by anarchists. It had been absconded with by a rival village's bell-ringing team. It had been taken as part of an obscure pagan ritual. Within 10 minutes the marrow competition was forgotten, its giant contenders now seeming absurdly trivial. The fate had lost its heart, its gentle rhythm broken by a single, silent beat. In a quiet corner near a wilting rosebush, Miss Agnes Petherbridge, a woman who served as the town's unofficial memory, was already providing historical context. "It's not without precedent, you know," she confided to a small, rapt audience. In 1882, the clapper of the old Vesper bell was found in Miller's Pond, a dispute over sheep grazing rights on the common. The Hemlock family painted the Thwaites prize ram with woad, and the Thwaites retaliated by silencing the 7 o'clock bell. It was their way of saying that civic order had broken down. She peered over her spectacles. One must always ask not what was taken, but what message the taking was intended to send. Pubright, overhearing this, filed it away. He preferred human nature to history, but he knew that in a place like Cartmell, the two were often the same thing. He turned to Sergeant Love, who was dutifully noting down Mr. Trimble's account. The verger was shaken but precise. The belfry door was locked as always. The key was on the board in the vestry. A second key was held by Major Eustace Blount, the head of the bell-ringing guild. No one else had access. The lock showed no signs of being forced. So the culprit must have had a key, Love concluded, with the satisfaction of a man finding a solid piece of driftwood in a sea of conjecture. Or, Pubright murmured, his eyes on the agitated face of the Reverend Finch, who was trying and failing to reassure his parishioners, found the door unlocked. An administrative oversight, perhaps? The suggestion hung in the air. An unlocked door was merely negligence. A theft with a key implied something more intimate, a betrayal. By mid-afternoon the fate had dissolved. The prize rosettes lay on a trestle table, their significance withered. Sergeant Love had a list of names, a description of a missing piece of cast iron weighing approximately 40 pounds, and a burgeoning headache. He stood with Pubright by the church porch, the scene of the crime. Well, sir, it's a public nuisance charge, technically. Malicious damage to parish property, Love said, trying to fit the crime into a neat box. We'll talk to this Major Blount. Sounds like a fussy type. Maybe the Reverend changed the ringing schedule and he took umbrage. Pubright did not reply immediately. He was watching Mrs. Gable march towards the town hall, her expression suggesting she was preparing to declare a state of emergency. He saw Miss Petherbridge cycling home, no doubt to consult her leather-bound almanacs. The silence from the tower was no longer a surprise. It was settling into a new, unwelcome routine. The town was realigning itself around the void. "I think," Pubright said at last, "we should begin by asking who loves the bell the most, Sergeant, and then perhaps who feels it has wronged them." He gestured politely towards the vicarage, starting with the man in charge of the church and the man who takes care of it. Their opinions on the matter should prove illuminating. The Reverend Alastair Finch's study was a room at war with itself. On one wall, a print of a startlingly abstract Holy Spirit, all jagged lines and primary colours, fought for dominance over a set of Morocco-bound theological texts that had not been disturbed since the reign of Edward VII. The air smelled faintly of instant coffee and anxiety. The vicar, having offered the policeman uncomfortable Scandinavian-designed chairs, was now perched on the edge of his own desk, wringing his hands as if trying to extract a difficult confession from them. "It's the message it sends." "Inspector," he began for the third time, "that's what concerns me. We're trying to build an inclusive, forward-looking community here. We want people to see St. Michael's as a welcoming space, not a fortress. An incident like this, it suggests a malice, a backwardness that is terribly detrimental to our outreach efforts." "Quite," Pubright said, his tone one of gentle commiseration. "And nothing else was disturbed? The collection box? The church silver?" "No, nothing. Thank heavens." That's what makes it so baffling. So pointless. It's sheer nihilism. A blow against the very idea of order. The vicar's vocabulary, Pubright noted, was that of a man who had recently read a sociology textbook. Sergeant Love, notebook poised, cleared his throat. "The verger, Mr. Trimble, stated that the belfry door was locked this morning. Can you confirm when you last saw it yourself, sir?" "Oh, heavens. I rarely go up there." "That's Cecil's. That's Mr. Trimble's domain entirely. He's very particular about it. About everything, in fact. A man of tremendous diligence." The compliment was delivered with the brittle cheer of a man describing a painful boil. "I would have passed the vestry door on my way to set up my bookstall for the fete, of course. Around 9, I should think. Everything seemed perfectly normal." "And the keys to the belfry?" Pubright asked, his gaze drifting to the abstract print. "Mr. Trimble mentioned a set on a board in the vestry." "That's right. For daily access, for the ringers and so on. We trust people here, Inspector. Or at least," he corrected himself with a sad little smile, "we did. One has to in a parish. Otherwise, what's the point?" He sighed, a gust of pastoral disappointment. "Cecil is a stickler for tradition. He believes some of our older fixtures and fittings are practically sacred. He resists any change, however small or necessary. He sees it as his duty to preserve the church exactly as it was in his grandfather's day. A commendable impulse, but not always helpful. The implication, as delicate as a spider's thread but just as strong, was clear. If anyone was likely to cause a fuss over the church's property, it was the man who treated it as his own. They found Cecil Trimble not in the vestry, but in the chancel, applying a lavender-scented wax polish to the eagle-shaped lectern with small circular motions. The task absorbed him completely. Here, surrounded by cold stone and stained glass, he seemed more at home than the vicar did in his own study. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and centuries of prayer. He straightened up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "Inspector, Mr. Trimble," Pubright began, his voice lowered to match the church's hush. "We were just clarifying the matter of access. You would have been the first to enter the church this morning at 7 o'clock, as I am every day. To open up, and you went to the vestry, of course. To get the cloths for the brass. Did you happen to notice if the key to the belfry was in its place on the board?" Sergeant Love asked, keen to pin down a fact. Trimble took a moment to reply, as if consulting an internal archive. "It was hook number 4, next to the key for the organ loft." So anyone could have taken it, used it, and returned it between 7 o'clock and noon.
Love pressed. A flicker of something, perhaps indignation, crossed the verger's face.
Anyone who had cause to be in the vestry, Sergeant. That is not a public thoroughfare. It is for staff, and for the Major when he collects the bell-ringing sheets. The Reverend Finch has been undertaking some new initiatives, I believe, Pubright said, his tone one of polite interest. Coffee mornings, changes to the service. The verger's polishing cloth paused in its orbit. The vicar is very
enthusiastic.
He has many ideas for making the church relevant to the modern age. The word relevant was pronounced as if it were a particularly unpleasant fungal infection.
He believes the past can be an obstacle. And you, Mr. Trimble?
What do you believe? The verger looked away from Pubright, his gaze resting on the cool, eternal stone of the nave. I believe this church has stood for 600 years, Inspector. It has survived plagues, wars, and reformations. It has done so because it is a place of constancy, not of fashion. Some things are not meant to be changed. He resumed his polishing, the rhythmic squeak of the cloth on brass, the only sound in the vast, quiet space. The missing clapper, he seemed to imply, was not a singular crime, but merely one more symptom of a creeping, corrosive modernity. As they walked back out into the fading afternoon light, Sergeant Love flipped through his notebook with a frustrated air. Well, that's clear as mud, sir. They might as well have accused each other outright. The vicar thinks Trimble's an old fossil who'd do anything to stop things changing. Trimble thinks the vicar's a menace who doesn't respect the place. Motive all over the shop, but not a shred of proof. Pubright stopped and looked back at the silent tower, a dark finger pointing at the sky.
On the contrary, Sergeant, he said quietly.
I think we have learned a great deal. We have learned that in St. Michael's there are 2 custodians, but they are polishing 2 entirely different churches. Major Eustace Blount lived in a small, square brick house that appeared to have been built to military specifications. The privet hedge was trimmed with geometric precision, the gravel path was raked into perfect lines, and the front door knocker, a brass lion's head, was polished to a blinding sheen. The house did not welcome visitors, it inspected them. They found the Major in his study, a room so tidy it felt uninhabited. He was not polishing medals, but using a set of dental tools to remove a speck of dust from the hinge of a display case containing a collection of regimental cap badges. He stood as they entered, a man held together by discipline and indignation.
His back was straight, his moustache was a rigid grey line, and his eyes, the colour of a winter sky, were already blazing. Inspector, he said, his voice a clipped bark. I have been expecting you. An outrage, a bloody outrage.
In my 30 years of service, I've seen some damnable things, but to desecrate a house of God, to silence a bell?
It's an act of cultural Bolshevism. He had not invited them to sit.
He stood at attention, as if reporting a catastrophic failure of command to a superior officer. Sergeant Love, feeling the need to impose some sort of procedural order on the situation, opened his notebook. We understand you are the head of the bell-ringing guild, Major, Love began.
And that you hold a key to the church. Of course I hold a key.
The Major snapped. How else am I to maintain the Peel roster? How else am I to conduct practice? The key is a sacred trust. It has been for the 15 years I have had the honour of leading the Cartmell Guild, an honour, I might add, that seems to count for little when any Tom, Dick, or Harry can wander in and commit sacrilege. His fury was not hot and chaotic, but cold and intensely focused. It was the anger of a man whose perfectly calibrated world had been smashed by a vandal's brick. Pubright, watching him, thought that if one could weaponize righteous indignation, the Major could level a city block. Was there any reason for you to visit the church this morning, Major? Pubright asked quietly. None whatsoever. Saturday is for personal administration. The fate, he said the word as if it were a distasteful foreign dish, is not my concern. I was here, in this room, collating the performance reports from last Sunday's peal of the Grandsire triples. "We were 7 seconds off regulation time. Unacceptable." Sergeant Love's pencil scribbled furiously. A man obsessed with seconds would surely notice the absence of a 40-pound piece of iron, or, he thought, be driven to drastic action by some perceived flaw in its performance. "Have there been any disagreements lately?"
"Regarding the bells?"
Pubright inquired.
"Any changes to the schedule you were unhappy with?"
The Major's eyes narrowed. "You're referring to the vicar, no doubt. The Reverend Call Me Alistair Finch. His imitation was savage. The man has the spiritual backbone of a jellyfish. Disagreements? We have a permanent state of disagreement. He wanted to replace the All Saints' Day toll with a medley of uplifting modern hymns on the handbells. I informed him, in no uncertain terms, that we are the Cartmell Bell Ringing Guild, not a seaside talent show." He backed down.
"As he always does."
"The man has no fibre."
"And Mr. Trimble?"
A flicker of something akin to respect crossed the Major's face. "Trimble? Trimble understands duty. A sour old bird, but he knows his place. Knows the history. He uses the correct polish on the brasses."
"He wouldn't abide this chaos."
"Trimble is a fixed point."
"Unlike some." He paced the room, his fury needing motion.
"Do you know what that clapper represents, Inspector?"
"It is the voice of this town."
"It has marked births, deaths, and victories for 200 years. It was cast at the Whitechapel Foundry."
"It has a perfect F-sharp resonance."
"To remove it," he shook his head, momentarily lost for words. "It's like cutting the tongue out of a guardsman. Unthinkable." He stopped and glared at Love's notebook. "You're wasting your time here. This is the work of a degenerate. Some hooligan with no respect for history or property. You should be rounding up the usual layabouts, not bothering decent people." After a few more questions, which the Major answered with the brisk impatience of a man dealing with intellectual inferiors, Pubright and Love took their leave. The door was shut behind them with a definitive click before they had reached the bottom step. As they walked down the immaculate gravel path, Sergeant Love closed his notebook with a snap of finality. "Well, that's that then, sir," he said with confidence.
"He's our man."
The vicar tries to change the bell-ringing schedule, the Major has a fit, and he decides to teach everyone a lesson. "If I can't ring it my way, no one can ring it at all." He's got the key, the temper, and the obsession. It's a textbook crime of passion. Pubright paused at the perfectly trimmed hedge, looking back at the house that stood as a monument to rigid order. "His passion is certainly remarkable, Sergeant," he agreed, his tone thoughtful. "Almost too remarkable, sir?"
"A man who loves a voice that much," Pubright mused, half to himself.
"Would he really be the one to silence it? It seems technically correct, but emotionally out of tune." Sergeant Love's neat, logical world had been satisfyingly restored. He had a prime suspect, a plausible motive, and a clear line of inquiry. His notebook was a testament to methodical police work. Inspector Pubright's next request, therefore,
struck him as needlessly esoteric. "I'm going back to the church, Sergeant," Pubright had said,
as they stood on the pavement outside the Major's house. "To look for something specific, sir?"
Love asked, ready to deploy his evidence bags and measuring tape. "Not exactly. I just want to—"
"Listen to the silence," Love blinked. He filed the remark under the inspector's peculiarities and resolved to go and write up his report on the Major, which he felt was as good as a confession. Pubright let himself into the now empty church. The silence was indeed profound. Without the reassuring tick of the tower clock, which had been stopped pending investigation, the ancient building seemed to be holding its breath. He collected the vestry key from Mr. Trimble, who had the air of a man guarding a tomb, and made his way up the narrow, winding stone steps to the belfry. The ringing chamber was a practical, unadorned room, smelling of old rope and oiled wood. The great coloured ropes, with their woolly sallies, hung down from the ceiling like dormant pythons. Above, in the bell chamber itself, dust motes danced in the thin light from the louvred windows. Pubright looked at the huge, silent bell, old Matthew, and the empty space where its iron heart should have been. The mechanism was simple, a large lever, a wheel, and the fitting where the clapper had been bolted. There were no signs of a struggle, no splintered wood, no wrench marks on the bolts. The nuts had been undone cleanly, professionally. It was the work of someone who knew what they were doing, someone unhurried. It was not the work, Pubright reflected, of a man in the grip of a towering rage.
A furious man would have smashed something.
This was more like a careful, deliberate surgical procedure. He spent 20 minutes in the tower, touching nothing, merely absorbing the atmosphere. He was not looking for a clue in the forensic sense. He was looking for an anomaly, a note that was out of key with the room's established purpose. Finding none, he made his way back down the stone steps. It was at the bottom of the stairwell, just before the archway that led back towards the vestry, that he found it. It was not a thing but a smell, faint but distinct. Beneath the dominant sense of cold stone and beeswax polish, there was a clean, nutty, slightly oily aroma. He sniffed the air again. It was unmistakable. Linseed oil. Pubright stood perfectly still.
Linseed oil was for preservation.
For cricket bats, for wooden furniture, for ancient beams. It was the smell of patient maintenance. It had no place in the daily routine of bells and brasses. It was a smell of a different kind of work, a different kind of care. His attention sharpened, he let his gaze travel over the stone walls of the passage. It was a corridor people hurried through, a place of transit, not of interest, and for that reason, no one would have noticed the plaque. It was one of a dozen brass memorials to former churchwardens and benefactors, this one dedicated to a Josiah Trimble, 1850-1921,
a faithful servant of this parish. It was old, the black lettering faded,
the brass dulled by a century of indifferent air. But on the lower right-hand corner, cutting across the final digit of the date, was a small, fresh scratch. It was a bright, sharp line in the dull lacquer, no more than an inch long. Pubright bent closer. It was not a deep gouge, but a scrape, the kind of mark made by something heavy and angular being manoeuvred awkwardly through a narrow space. He straightened up. A peculiar smell and a tiny, insignificant scratch. Sergeant Love would have dismissed them in an instant. They were not evidence. They were noise, distractions from the clear, resonant signal of the Major's incandescent fury. But for Pubright, they were something else. They were a point of order. They were two small, quiet facts that did not belong to the story of a bell ringer's fit of pique. They belonged to a different story altogether, one he did not yet understand. He left the church, locking the door carefully behind him. He found Sergeant Love by the police car, looking impatient. "Find anything, sir?" Love asked, hopeful for something concrete. "Perhaps," Pubright said, his expression giving nothing away. "Just a slight scent of dissent, Sergeant, and a reminder that even the most faithful servants can leave a mark." Sunday in Cartmell arrived with a profound sense of incompleteness. The rhythms of the day, usually punctuated by the church bells calling the faithful, were disjointed. People setting off for morning service glanced instinctively at the silent tower, a mild but persistent feeling of grievance settling over the town. It felt, as one resident remarked in the queue at the baker's, like a man wearing a suit with no tie. Inspector Pubright, forgoing the service, took a walk to the edge of town where Miss Agnes Petherbridge lived in a cottage that seemed to be constructed entirely of books and local history. He found her tending her roses, a task she approached with the same forensic intensity she applied to the parish archives. A sad day for the town.
"Inspector," she said, snipping a dead head with grim satisfaction.
A Sunday with no peel is a Sunday without its spine. "I was hoping you might be able to put some flesh on a few old bones for me, Miss Petherbridge," Pubright said, admiring a particularly robust-looking bloom. "I was in the church yesterday and happened to notice the memorial plaques. The Trimble family seems to have been very prominent. Miss Petherbridge's eyes lit up. This was her true territory.
Prominent?
My dear Inspector, the Trimbles were Cartmell for the better part of 3 centuries. They owned the wool mill, the coaching inn, most of the water meadows. The land St. Michael's stands on was a gift from the first Josiah Trimble in the 1680s. The plaque you saw for the second Josiah marks the end of the line, financially speaking. A series of poor investments in Argentinian railways, I believe, terribly common at the time. She led him inside to a parlour where maps of the county jostled for wall space with framed genealogical charts. Our Mr. Trimble Cecil is the great-grandson of the man on that plaque. All that's left of the family's wealth is the name and a fierce, unyielding pride.
He's not simply a verger, you see.
In his own mind, he is a custodian guarding his family's last and greatest heirloom, the church itself. And other heirlooms? Pubright prompted gently. Did the family donate much to the church's interior?
Everything of value,
she declared, tapping a dusty ledger. The great silver communion chalice, the patens, the alms dish, all of it bears the Trimble crest.
A small stooping badger for their name.
Cecil polishes it every week.
They say he talks to it.
It's the last tangible link to his family's former glory. For him to be a paid servant in a building his ancestors practically owned, well, it requires a certain kind of temperament, a quiet one. Pubright absorbed this. The quiet verger was suddenly a figure of tragic, dynastic significance. His proprietary air was not just that of a diligent employee, it was that of a dispossessed monarch tending his own mausoleum. Leaving Miss Petherbridge's cottage, his mind quietly rearranging the facts of the case, Pubright almost walked directly into Mrs. Millicent Gable. She was returning from the morning service, her hat at a distinctly militant angle, an absolute disgrace.
"Inspector," she announced without preamble.
The Reverend Finch gave a sermon on the sounds of silence. The man's attempts at relevance are becoming a public menace. What people want is not a sermon, but a bell. Is there any progress? We are pursuing several lines of inquiry, Mrs. Gable. Well, I hope one of them leads to a practical solution, she sniffed. This whole sorry affair only strengthens my view that we cannot be beholden to antiquated equipment. It's unreliable. It's a security risk. The future must be electric. Pubright feigned polite ignorance.
Electric?
A proper modern carillon system, she said, her voice filled with a planner's zeal. Digitally operated. No ropes, no clappers, no nonsense. The Reverend Finch is entirely on board.
In fact, it was his idea to fund it. An expensive undertaking, surely?
Mrs. Gable lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper.
He has a most sensible plan.
There is a great deal of dusty, unused silver in a vault in that church. Georgian, I believe. It serves no purpose whatsoever, just sitting in the dark. Utterly redundant. A valuation from a London auction house suggested it could more than cover the cost of a new community hall, with the bell system included. A resource for the whole town, Inspector. Proper modern facilities, she beamed.
Killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Or rather, melting down 2 dusty old cups to build a brighter future. The pieces clicked into place in Purbright's mind with the quiet finality of a well-made lock.
The Trimble silver, the verger's last tangible link to his family's past, dismissed as dusty old cups. And this plan is public knowledge, he asked. It has been discussed at the parish council. There has been some sentimental opposition. Mr. Trimble, naturally, is against it, and the Major, for that matter. They see it as vandalism. We see it as progress. Pubright looked back towards the church. The crime was no longer a simple act of petty rage or protest. It had acquired a new and powerful motive, rooted in history, pride, and the cold reality of an auctioneer's valuation. The silence of the bell was no longer just an absence of sound. It was an argument. It was a shouted whisper, a desperate attempt to make the town listen to a history it was determined to sell for scrap. Monday brought with it the mundane business of the working week, a routine that felt slightly hollow without the noon bell to anchor it. The affair of the missing clapper had settled into that peculiar phase of a small-town mystery where official activity seemed to cease, replaced by the far more vigorous and imaginative investigation being conducted in pubs, post office queues, and over garden fences. Sergeant Love's preferred suspect, Major Blount, had been seen striding about town with an expression of thunderous fury, which was interpreted by the populace as either clear proof of his guilt or clear proof of his innocence. It was just after 10 o'clock when the telephone rang on Inspector Pirbright's desk. It was the Reverend Finch, his voice a tight knot of clerical agitation. "Inspector, I do apologize for bothering you, but something rather irregular has occurred."
"I felt you ought to be made aware."
"It's in relation to the Sunday collection." Pubright and Love found the vicar and Mr. Trimble in the vestry, standing over a small wooden collection box as if it contained an unexploded bomb. The box was open, and its meagre contents, a smattering of loose change and a few folded banknotes, were spread across a piece of blotting paper on the table. In the centre of this small pile of everyday currency lay a single, incongruous object. It was a gold coin, thick and heavy, gleaming with a soft, buttery lustre that made the modern money around it look cheap and flimsy. Mr. Trimble, who had made the discovery while performing his Monday morning duty of counting the collection, pointed a trembling finger.
"There, in the box from the south aisle. It was just—"
"There." Sergeant Love picked it up, weighing it in his palm.
"A sovereign," he said, surprised. "I haven't seen one of these in years. Victoria, 1889. He looked at the vicar.
"A very generous parishioner you have, sir." "It's not a donation, it's a complication," the vicar fretted. "There are procedures for this sort of thing. Bequests, legacies. One can't simply drop bullion into the collection plate. It raises questions."
"Tax implications." Pubright took the coin from Love. It felt warm, its milled edges still sharp.
It was a beautiful object, a small, solid piece of a more certain world. It was not the sort of thing one gave away lightly, and certainly not anonymously. He looked from the coin to the two men. The vicar, who saw a bureaucratic headache, and the verger, who simply looked bewildered, as if he had found a holy relic in the Hoover bag. "Could it be a mistake?" Pubright asked Trimble. "Fallen from a purse, perhaps?" The verger shook his head slowly. "The box has a narrow slot, Inspector. You could not drop this in by accident. It would have to be posted through, deliberately. Sergeant Love, ever the pragmatist, was already forming a theory."
"It's the Major, sir. Has to be. He's feeling guilty. This is his conscience money. A first instalment on a new clapper." Pubright turned the coin over in his fingers, feeling the crisp profile of the young queen.
He thought of the plan to sell the church's silver, to liquidate its past for the promise of a brighter, more functional future. He thought of the Trimble crest on that silver, and the quiet, dispossessed man who polished it each week.
A donation was an act of giving.
The crime had been an act of taking. What if they weren't opposed, but were in fact part of the same silent, desperate conversation? "I'm not so sure it's a payment for damages, Sergeant," Pubright murmured, placing the coin carefully back on the blotting paper.
"It feels more like a—"
"Contribution to the debate, sir. This coin," Pubright explained, his voice quiet and thoughtful, "is a symbol of a certain kind of value."
"Old solid, unchanging."
"The kind of value that is inherent, not speculative. It is the very opposite of an auctioneer's estimate." He looked at the Reverend Finch. "Tell me, Vicar, was yesterday's collection for the general fund or for a specific purpose?" The vicar blinked. "Why, it was for the Church Preservation Fund. We have some damp in the north transept. Mr. Trimble is always most particular that the collection from the first Sunday of the month goes towards the building's upkeep." Pubright nodded slowly.
"Of course it was."
"So this isn't a gesture of guilt," he said, more to himself than to the others. "It's a vote. It's an offering made to the fabric of the church, not to its administration. Someone is reminding us that there are other ways to raise funds than by selling the family silver. He left the coin on the table, a gleaming gold protest in a sea of official procedure. The mystery of the silent bell had just acquired a new voice, and it spoke not in threats or anger, but in the archaic, dignified language of antiquity. Back in the quiet order of his office at the Chalmsbury station, Inspector Pubright sat not with a file of evidence, but with a single gold sovereign now sealed in a small plastic bag. It lay on his desk, an absurdly dramatic exhibit for a crime that officially consisted of nothing more than a missing lump of iron. Sergeant Love had filed his reports, his theories neatly typed and pointing with unwavering certainty towards Major Blount. It was, in Love's view, a case of aggravated indignation, and it was only a matter of time before the Major's temper cracked and he confessed. Pubright, however, was not thinking about the Major's temper. He was contemplating the peculiar mechanics of the English parish. He looked out of his window at the market square, where life proceeded with its usual unflustered rhythm. A town like Cartmell, he mused, was not a single entity, but a collection of competing histories, all existing simultaneously. There was Mrs. Gable's history, which began with the minutes of the last council meeting and aimed for a future of tarmacked car parks and efficient public services. There was the Reverend Finch's history, a more recent volume concerned with relevance and community engagement, in which the past was a rather dusty and inconvenient prologue, and then there was the other kind, the one embodied by the Major's obsession with the precise timing of appeal that had been wrung for centuries, and by Mr. Trimble's quiet, weekly polishing of his ancestors' silver. This was not history as a record, but as a living, breathing, and often burdensome inheritance. It was the weight of tradition. And weight, Pubright knew, could make people do strange things. It could make them stand straighter, or it could make them stoop. Or it could make them push back, quietly and stubbornly, when they felt that weight was being lifted without their permission. The crime, he was now certain, was not a crime of passion. Passion was loud, messy, and straightforward, like the Major's fury. This was a crime of profound, calculated principle. To silence a bell is not to destroy it. It is to make a point about the nature of its voice. It is to say, listen to the quiet. Something is wrong. It was a protest designed not for the ears, but for the soul. And then there was the sovereign, an act of giving to counterbalance the act of taking. It was a gesture of exquisite, almost literary neatness. It was a contribution to the preservation fund, a tangible vote cast in favor of the church's fabric over the vicar's ambitions. It was someone stating in the only language they felt they had left that the past was not a liability to be sold off, but an endowment to be honoured. Pubright picked up the small bag. The coin, minted in the heyday of an empire, spoke of permanence. The plan to sell the silver spoke of the modern world's restless expediency. The silent bell was the fulcrum on which these two irreconcilable ideas were balanced. He thought of the people involved. The modernizer, the zealot, the bureaucrat, and the custodian. Each of them was, in his own way, deeply and sincerely convinced of his own righteousness. And in the quiet wars of an English market town, there was no more dangerous explosive than sincere, righteous conviction. The problem was not identifying a culprit who had broken the law, but an antagonist who believed he was upholding a higher one. He stood up and placed the sovereign carefully in his desk drawer. The time for gathering facts was over. The contradictory statements, the subtle accusations, the scent of linseed oil and the scratch on the brass plaque were all just grammar. He understood the sentence now. All that remained was to find the author and to persuade him to provide the final punctuation. His next step would not be an interrogation, but a conversation. A very polite, very English conversation held in the right place, with the right people, in which a single, carefully chosen question might just cause the whole delicate structure of pretense to collapse. On Tuesday morning, Inspector Pubright arranged a meeting. The pretext, delivered by telephone in his most reassuringly bureaucratic tone, was a discussion of enhanced security protocols for St. Michael's in light of the recent unfortunate event. It was a request that no one in a position of responsibility could reasonably refuse. The venue he chose was the vestry itself. By 10 o'clock, they were all assembled, the room smelling of old paper, cassocks, and Mr. Trimble's lavender polish. Felt crowded with the three men, Pubright, and a silent, note-taking Sergeant Love, the Reverend Finch, attempting to project an air of calm leadership. Arranged and rearranged a small pile of hymn books. Major Blount stood ramrod straight by the door, as if guarding it against further incursions of chaos, and Mr. Trimble in his own domain was a model of quiet deference. Pouring lukewarm water from a copper kettle for tea he seemed sure no one would drink. "Thank you all for coming," Pubright began, his voice calm and conversational. "I won't take up much of your time. It's clear that a review of security is in order. The question of keys for a start."
"A logbook might be a prudent step," the Major grunted in agreement.
"Should have been done years ago."
"Too much laxity."
"That's the problem." The Reverend Finch smiled weakly. "Of course, Inspector. Any practical suggestions you have would be most welcome. We want to be fully cooperative." Pubright let the mundane topic hang in the air for a moment before moving on. "Then there is the matter of the stolen property. I have made a preliminary inquiry with a foundry in Loughborough regarding the cost of casting a new clapper for a bell of that size and age." He paused. "The figure is, as you might expect, quite substantial." The vicar visibly winced, his mind no doubt running through the church's already strained budget.
Good heavens! I had no idea. Mere money," the Major scoffed.
"It's the principle of the thing. The violation." Purbright's gaze rested for a fraction of a second on Mr. Trimble, who was wiping the inside of a clean porcelain cup with a clean cloth. The verger's expression was as ever impassive. "Quite so," Pubright agreed smoothly. "But the incident does force us to consider the value, and indeed the legal status, of all church property." He turned his tone slightly more academic, as if sharing a curious historical tidbit. "I found myself looking into a spot of ecclesiastical law last night, a fascinatingly labyrinthine subject. It seems the key precedent for donated artifacts is a case from the early 19th century, the Chiswick Bequest, I believe it was called." He saw he had their attention. The vicar leaned forward, interested. The Major looked suspicious of this legalistic detour. "The long and short of it," Pubright continued, his voice betraying nothing but mild intellectual curiosity, "is that the ruling was quite definitive. Once a family donates an item to the church, be it a chalice, a plaque, a bell, all ancestral claims to that item are permanently and irrevocably extinguished. It becomes the sole disposable asset of the serving parish council. The original family, legally speaking, has no more say over its fate than any other member of the public." The effect of this carefully constructed falsehood was immediate
and threefold. The Reverend Finch's face cleared with an expression of pure, unadulterated relief.
It was as if a great weight had been lifted from his pastoral shoulders. "Is that so, Inspector?" he said, a new note of confidence in his voice. "Well, that is
extraordinarily clarifying.
It certainly simplifies some of our more difficult fundraising decisions. Thank you." He was already, Pubright could see, mentally drafting a motion for the next council meeting. Major Blount, meanwhile, bristled with indignation. "Legal claptrap,"
he snapped.
"That is a lawyer's answer, not a gentleman's. A family's legacy is a matter of honour, not some dusty legal precedent. The idea that a committee of shopkeepers can simply sell off a piece of history." He shook his head in disgust, his moral universe offended. Pubright barely heard them. His full attention was on the third man. Mr. Trimble had stopped wiping the cup. He had placed it down on the small wooden table, but his hand remained resting on its rim. All the colour had drained from his face, leaving it the colour of old parchment. He stared at Pubright, and his expression was not one of anger or of guilt, but of a profound and devastating shock. It was the look of a man who had dedicated his life to guarding a sacred trust, only to be told by an unimpeachable authority that the trust had never legally existed. His quiet, lifelong custodianship, the one thing that gave him status and meaning beyond that of a simple servant, had just been declared null and void. His shoulders, almost imperceptibly, seemed to slump. It was all Pubright needed to see. He smiled politely. "Well, as I say, it's a fascinatingly obscure point of law. Thank you, gentlemen, that's all for now. You've been most helpful." He ushered a bewildered Sergeant Love out of the vestry, leaving the three men in a suddenly thick and awkward silence. "Sir?" Love whispered, once they were outside in the churchyard.
"I don't understand."
"What was all that about?" Pubright looked up at the silent tower, his expression calm and clear. "That, Sergeant," he said, "was about establishing the difference between a point of order and a point of law, and watching a man who has lived his entire life by one be utterly broken by the other." An hour after the meeting in the vestry, Inspector Pubright sat once more in the Reverend Alistair Finch's study. The vicar was still buzzing with the possibilities that Purbright's legal revelation had opened up. The community hall, once a distant dream, now seemed a tangible reality. "It changes the entire landscape, Inspector," he was saying. "Removes the emotional element and replaces it with simple, practical administration."
"I can't thank you enough. There is one remaining emotional element to consider," Pubright said quietly.
"And for that, I have asked Mr. Trimble to join us." A moment later, the verger entered. He did not look at the vicar, but at Pubright, his face pale and composed, his eyes holding the deep, weary calm of a man who knows a long battle is finally over. He sat in the chair Pubright indicated, his hands resting on his knees. "Mr. Trimble," Pubright began, his tone gentle, "this has never been an investigation into a simple act of vandalism."
"Vandalism is loud and careless."
The removal of the bell clapper was quiet, careful, and precise. It was not the work of a man in a rage. He glanced at the vicar. "Which is why I never seriously suspected Major Blount. His anger was altogether too public. The person who did this was not angry. He was sorrowful. The room was silent. The Reverend Finch looked from Pubright to his verger, a slow, dawning unease on his face. "The crime was never about the bell," Pubright continued. "The bell was merely the means of communication. The subject, as you rightly guessed this morning, Vicar, was the church's heritage, specifically the proposed sale of the Trimble silver." He let that sink in before he began to lay out the quiet, trivial details he had observed. A 40-pound clapper is an awkward burden to carry down a narrow, winding staircase in the dark. A man carrying such an object might steady himself against the wall, and in doing so his burden might accidentally scrape against a brass plaque, a plaque commemorating a man named Josiah Trimble. He looked at the verger, whose eyes did not flicker. That was the first thing that felt out of place. The second was a smell, a faint scent of linseed oil near the vestry door. It is the smell of careful preservation, the scent of someone who looks after old wood. It is not a smell one associates with bell mechanisms. It is the smell, I thought, of a man who takes great care of the things he considers valuable. Pubright paused, allowing the vicar to follow his logic.
The clapper was not destroyed.
It was not sold for scrap. To do so would be to commit the same sin the culprit was protesting. No, the clapper was put away. Preserved. I imagine it is somewhere dry and safe, perhaps wrapped in Hessian sacking that has been treated with oil, waiting for the day it could be restored, waiting for the day the church came to its senses. Finally, he addressed the last piece of the puzzle. And then came the offering. A gold sovereign from a time of certainty, placed not in the general fund, but in the box for the preservation of the church's fabric. It was not the act of a guilty conscience. It was a quiet, dignified statement. A vote cast in gold for heritage over commerce. It was a man making a donation to save the very things the administration was planning to sell.
A single coin to protest the melting down of his family's silver. Pubright leaned forward slightly. All these things, you see, are part of the same story.
They are an unspoken sermon delivered by a man who felt he had no other way to be heard, a man who has spent his life as a servant in the church his ancestors built, who saw the last vestiges of his family's legacy about to be sold off to fund what he could only see as a modern folly. He looked directly at the verger. He silenced the church's public voice, vicar, because he felt his own private historical voice was being ignored. He did not do it out of malice. He did it out of love. The silence in the study was absolute. The Reverend Finch stared at Mr. Trimble as if seeing him for the first time, not as a difficult employee, but as a man of deep, wounded principle. The verger, for his part, did not weep or protest. A single, slow tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, but his expression remained one of dignified resignation. He had been heard. After a long moment he spoke, his voice a low murmur. They were christened with that silver. They were married with it. It was given to God, not to a committee. He looked at the vicar, his gaze direct and filled with a profound, centuries-old sadness. "You were going to melt down my family's soul." The Reverend Finch had the decency to look ashamed. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Pubright broke the silence. "The law has its own view, of course," he said calmly, "but I have always found that the best solution in a parish dispute is a parish understanding. No report has been filed beyond a note on misplaced property. All that is required, I think, is for the property to be found." He looked at the verger. "Where is the clapper, Mr. Trimble?" The verger stood up slowly, his duty, as always, taking precedence. "It is in the old crypt, Inspector, beneath the Trimble family vault. I was keeping it safe." He turned to the vicar, a custodian once more. "I can take you there now, if you wish." There was no formal police recovery from the Trimble family vault. Such a thing would have been unpleasantly dramatic. Instead, 2 days later, a junior choir boy, searching for a misplaced sheet of music, discovered the missing clapper tucked away in a dusty corner of the organ loft, neatly wrapped in oiled hessian. The news was received not with suspicion, but with a collective sigh of civic relief. It was a far more palatable explanation than theft, suggesting a simple, if baffling, misplacement by persons unknown. Major Blount oversaw the reinstallation with the solemnity of a state funeral, issuing clipped commands to the workmen and personally testing the torque on the final bolt. In the town hall, Councillor Gable expressed her profound delight that the town's reputation had been restored, making no mention of the now-defunct plan for an electronic carillon. At the Sunday service that followed, the Reverend Alistair Finch delivered a sermon on the virtues of heritage and the importance of listening to the quiet voices of the past. He announced that following a period of reflection, the parish council had decided to postpone any sale of church assets, launching instead a new St. Michael's preservation drive to which he was humbled to announce a first anonymous donation of a gold sovereign had already been made. From his position by the chancel steps, Mr. Cecil Trimble watched the vicar, his expression unchanged, as he had for decades, but his posture seemed a fraction straighter. The polishing of the church silver that week, it was noted, was particularly brilliant. Inspector Pubright did not attend the service. He was in his office, catching up on paperwork that had accumulated during the brief but intense theological dispute. The file for the silent bell lay on his desk. Sergeant Love had, with some professional disappointment, amended his own report on the Major's likely guilt. "So it was just misplaced after all, sir," he said, looking at Purbright's final summary.
"Extraordinary. All that fuss." "Quite extraordinary," Pubright agreed, not looking up. He finished his entry in the log.
Under the heading Nature of Crime, he had written Theft of Church Property. He now neatly crossed this out. In its place he wrote Misplaced Church Property. Item recovered. Case closed. It was just approaching noon. He paused, pen in hand. From across the water meadows, travelling on the clear autumn air, came a sound. It was a deep, resonant, and entirely familiar F-sharp, rolling over the rooftops of Cartmell, reassuring the town that the universe, and more importantly, lunchtime, was back in its proper place. Pubright nodded once.
A small, private gesture of satisfaction.
He placed the file in his out tray and picked up the next one, a tedious but blessedly straightforward report concerning inadequate bicycle parking facilities behind the public library.